We're here at ConneXions 2019 with Paul from NRECA.
You have it. Yeah.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about NRECA, and that'll set up the conversation for the panel that you moderated yesterday.
You got it, Ken. So NRECA is the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. We represent America's electric co-ops, about 900 electric co-ops in the country, spread out through 48 states. And a lot of co-ops, what you're seeing in rural America, we're trying to help bridge the urban-rural divide in terms of lack of access to broadband, high-speed broadband. And there's about 21 million Americans in the country without access, and most of those are in electric co-op territory. So we are working we're deploying broadband, we're partnering to deploy broadband, and we're trying to bring high-speed internet to rural America. So that's.
When you talk about a co-op, for people in urban areas, they're not really familiar with those. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what that means?
Sure. The history of electric co-ops dates back to the 40s and 50s, the Rural Electrification Act. And back in the 40s and 50s, the farms and the farmers, they didn't have electricity, right? So the big investor-owned utilities did not want to serve the farms. It didn't make financial sense to them. So the co-ops got together, the farmers got together, banded together, and created these electric co-ops and brought electricity to the farms themselves. And the way we're structured, electric co-ops, we're not-for-profit private corporations. We are owned by the consumers at the end of the line. They own their systems and they control their systems. We are managed by board of directors. Each electric co-op has its own board of directors, and like I mentioned, there's over 900 co-ops in the country.
And they're doing broadband, and that was the topic of your panel yesterday. Why don't you tell us first a little bit about what you're seeing in the industry, electric industry, as far as disruption?
Well, let me put it two ways. So when we think of broadband at the utility service, on the utility side, we really focus on that backbone, right? As we move to the smart grid of the future and what that means to electric utilities, it's really empowering the utility to make smart decisions, right? So we focus on building out that advanced communications infrastructure at the utility level, and then what they're doing is they're leveraging those investments to serve their consumers. And what we've seen is this shift, the traditional shift down to the consumer side. We like to call it more choice, control, convenience, and cost. Those four things are very important to the consumers. And in the industry, on the consumer side, there's really a disruption, as you mentioned. Electric utilities, especially co-ops, we are focused on those consumers. They own the systems. We're not for profit. We don't have to have returns. We're in the business to help our communities. One of the co-op principles is concern for community, so we're always focused on what we're doing at home. And when we see disruptors, and whether it's, imagine like IKEA, you go to the IKEA store now, you see these suite of home services, smart lights and thermostats, etc., and it's Google Nest, and we support those, but a lot of those services are disrupting the traditional utility value, right? And we love the idea of demand response and demand management to the meter and beyond, and so when our business is electricity, we want to help grow electricity and help the consumers, and we like to call it beneficial electrification, which is let's do good, let's use clean energy, and let's help our communities and continue that increasing electricity at home. We think there's really great use cases for beneficial electrification, and so in the industry, when you have folks like the solar providers, a number of them are coming in, and we want to help our consumers. We want them to work with us and not necessarily the disruptors.
Well, and Steve Collier mentioned that really, in effect, you're rebuilding the entire electricity network from one-way to two-way, right?
Yeah, you are. So the traditional power flow, it's this central station base load generation, right? Those big base load power plants, and that's been the traditional way, right? And those serve the consumers. It goes from the central station on the generation side down to the distribution side and then down to the retail side. And what we're seeing now is this two-way power flow, right? So The power flows, whether it's plug-in vehicles or solar on the roof, and it's flowing back and forth. It's more distributed, it's more cleaner, and so we work with the electric co-ops across the country to be responsive to that.
Well, and that was one of the things that I got from Steve's presentation, is that fiber is a huge driver to make that work, right?
So fiber is definitely a huge driver. Anytime you're talking about those demand response programs, those energy efficiency programs, without that high-speed connection all the way to the meter and actually into the home, you're not going to get the smart grid. So as over the last, I would probably say, 5 years, Ken, we've seen just this evolution of the traditional utility model, and I like to call it evolution from the traditional case into the energy cloud. It's more energy services. So not only are co-ops and electric utilities providing more just energy, we're providing energy services, right? And that could be managing home load, working with our consumers on smart appliances, and all kinds of programs. And then that impacts the grid, right? So you want to have a balanced grid. So the high-speed fiber is really important to that piece of it.
Well, and how things changed. I mean, for many years, there's been decades, really, there's been talk about doing this, but what's really made it that difference?
In terms of?
Making the smart grid a reality. It's complicated to run a communications network, right?
It is complicated, and when we look at this new business that co-ops are getting into, it's different than the traditional utility business. So it's different workforce, it's different technical capabilities, it's different operations, and so as we've evolved moved into this space, it's provided us the opportunity to work with the communities, and I like to say technology drives the evolution of the utility model. In the case of co-ops, that's particularly true. The market certainly drives us. Technology drives, and then there's some policy related to that. And you either embrace evolution or you get left in the past. And co-ops are really embracing the move forward into the next generation of the smart grid.
Well, yeah, and listening to David, I don't think he was on your panel, David Gervin from United Communications. Several years ago, I actually had a chance to visit them, and the epiphany I had was, because you have fiber now, you have a much simpler network. You have two endpoints, basically, so it's much easier to maintain, right?
Absolutely. Your system, your entire system, your entire utility system is stronger, and that's what I was talking about, that backbone, that backbone, the fiber backbone on the utility side, whether it's internal communications, but it's also those fiber rings to each of the substations, and you can control and manage your load. It's really essential to today's electric utilities.
Great. Well, any last takeaways that you had from the panel yesterday?
No, yes. I thought the panel was exceptional. The idea that we're moving into this space is exciting for me. That the smart grid and the interconnectedness of the electric co-ops and that advanced communications infrastructure. I will say something, Ken. In terms of co-ops, often are associated with that rural America, sort of behind the times. That's not the case at all. What we're not always good at is advertising all the great things we're doing, and because we just do it. Yeah. So sometimes it takes us a little bit longer, but because we're small, and controlled by our board of directors, we can move quickly. So we make a lot of investment in the utility infrastructure. We're making investment into high speed and fiber. So it's a really exciting time.
Well, it is, and I visited many of your members, and I'm always impressed when I visit them. So, Paul, appreciate your time.
Thank you.